Do it.
Hello and welcome to one of the Center for Women and Gender Equity's Women of Color Leadership Summit speakers. I'm Casey Farrell-Snyder. I'm the director of the Center for Women and Gender Equity and the co-director of the Center for Violence Prevention Education, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I have the honor of welcoming our speaker, Ashley Futrell, whose presentation is entitled Speak to be Heard, Advocating for Social Justice in 2021. Ashley Futrell is an attorney at law at Shumaker, Loop & Kendrick, LLP. An established litigator and counselor, Ashley represents clients of all sizes on complex litigation, labor and employment, and white-collar matters. Ashley is a former assistant United States attorney in the criminal division of the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio, where she investigated and prosecuted federal crimes, including public corruption and white-collar cases. She served as a point of contact for federal and state agencies on federal crimes. Ashley began her law career as an assistant district attorney in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, where she investigated and prosecuted all phases of misdemeanor and felony cases and represented New York County in criminal hearings and trials. Before law school, Ashley served as a senior staff member on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where she advised several members of Congress on a wide variety of legislative issues. She also worked to secure federal funding for urban parks and conservation and built national coalitions for national conservation organizations. Ashley is a leader in her community. In 2019, she was the recipient of Toledo's 20 Under 40 Leadership Recognition Award. She serves on the board of directors for Toledo Bar Association, the Toledo Opera, United Way of Greater Toledo's Women's Initiative, Leadership Toledo, and the Toledo Alliance for Performing Arts, which is a merger of the Toledo Symphony and Toledo Ballet, as well as a former board member of the Junior League of Toledo. Ashley is also a member of the Toledo chapter of the Links Incorporated and the International Women's Forum. Ashley received her BA in Law and Society from American University, her MA in Government from Johns Hopkins University, and her Juris Doctor from Howard University School of Law. Thank you, Ashley, so much for being with us. And I'm going to turn it over to you to share your presentation with us. And we are really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Casey. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for Bowling Green State University's Center for Women and Gender Equity. It is such an honor to talk to all of you today and just to learn about the other speakers and the incredible work that the center is doing. So thank you so much. As Casey said, my name is Ashley Futrell, and I'm a native Toledoan. I am someone who was born and raised in the Midwest. And after high school, because I was very interested in politics and law, I attended college at American University in Washington, D.C. And through that experience, I had the chance to work on Capitol Hill when I graduated as a senior staffer. And I had the opportunity to learn how laws are made and what goes on behind the scenes. So, when I thought about what I wanted to present today, I thought about all of the events that have happened in the recent year, but also things that have been happening in our community when it comes to social justice issues. So I want to talk to you today about finding your role in the social justice movement and advocating for these social justice policy issues in 2021 and beyond. So the key learning objectives today for my presentation are first, to identify key policymakers and their needs. We're going to talk about how do you find who's the person that you want to talk to about the issues you have, with our current social justice movement and the type of issues that you'd like to advocate for. We're going to also talk about communicating with these policymakers. One of the things that I'll discuss is the fact that oftentimes it's not the actual member of Congress or member of city council that you want to talk to. Sometimes it's their staff. Another learning objective is creating a policy agenda. It is so important to be organized and to figure out what current bills, right, or resolutions, what current legislation or potential legislation exists that can help you to achieve your policy goal. Or if it doesn't exist, how do we figure out a way to make sure that it is introduced, right? And that's where you can come in terms of really putting the meat on the bones of an idea. Another learning objective is developing the messaging and strategies for advocacy. And that's where the bulk of this presentation will focus. the idea of what is my messaging? Because it's one thing to have an idea, it's another thing to know how to craft a message that will be listened to by those thought leaders or those policy makers. And also advocating, setting up that meeting and what we should do to make sure that, again, that we're listened to, taken seriously, and that your goals are accomplished. And finally, after the meeting, how do we build coalitions to make sure that it's not just you that's out here carrying this message, but you have other advocates and other people that are your allies that are helping you to also make sure that this idea you have, right, this policy goal and objective actually becomes reality. So May 25th, 2020, as many of you know, that was the day that George Floyd died. Now, many of us have seen the videos countless times, and we know just how horrific that scene was when a police officer knelt on George Floyd's neck. And many of us, we were frustrated, we were angry, we were afraid, we had anxiety, and many of us felt hopeless. So we protested, we posted on social media, we talked to our friends, we talked to colleagues in our offices, and it opened a dialogue that was needed. And many of us also know that this was not the first time that we had an incident like that occur in this country. It goes back to Emmett Till, it goes back to Rodney King, and so many others who have died in such a way. But many of you felt like you wanted to do something, and you did. Again, you protested, you talked to friends and families, and you were outraged by the events that happened. So again, these were the feelings that we felt. We felt devalued. We felt discouraged in many different ways. But that's where, I thought to myself, how can we turn our frustration, our anger, our hopelessness into actual action to change things? So I thought, advocacy, that is how we can do this. I thought that in my mind, every single person has a role in the social justice movement. And it's up to each of us to figure out what is our role. And to be clear, we all have a role. And the idea is to figure out what is my lane and how can I be helpful to making change in our society. And as Casey mentioned, you're probably wondering, why are you talking about this? And the reason why I'm discussing this today is because, yes, I'm an attorney at Shumaker, Loop and Kendrick, but also I am a former federal advocate. And I am someone who worked on Capitol Hill who can tell you how these things are done and how policy decisions are made. And this is not just at the federal level, it's also the local and state level as well. So I want to make sure that you have the tools so that we can turn that frustration and anger that we had into action. As I mentioned before, everyone has a role in the social justice movement because this is our community and this is our world that we live in. And we want to make it as best as we can for ourselves, our families, but also the next generation as well. As I mentioned, everyone's role is not the same. There will be people who are agitators, and that is their job, is to be an agitator. There will be others who are creating coalitions and trying to find out, what is our role here? What are the policy issues that can be changed so that we can have a better, relationship between, for example, with the social justice movement, the police, and communities of color. So everyone has a role in this movement, and everyone's role is not the same. So we have to find our lane. One example that I often give is the Toledo Opera. And I'm very grateful and honored to be a board member of the Toledo Opera. But when the events happened with George Floyd, when that horrific incident occurred, the Toledo Opera didn't just come out with a statement like many organizations, but they were already doing the work. They had a community engagement committee that consisted of members of our Toledo community and the Northwest Ohio community. And this particular group, we talked about, what is the opera's role? What is the arts community's role when it comes to social justice? And we talk about, how to make sure that the opera, for example, is an inclusive space and that it's a space where people feel welcomed and people feel like they can have a voice and that the opera is a part of our community. And that might mean making sure that we have different types of operas that represent the face of our community and that all faces are represented on stage but also in the planning process, and that we make sure that we don't have any blind spots, that we make sure that there's nothing that's happening that we feel would be offensive to our brothers and our sisters in our community. So again, that's how the opera used their lane to make, and how they continue to use their lane to make positive differences. But the reality is each of us can do it in our lanes as well. So we have to figure out how we can contribute to the social justice movement. And also finding allies, and I call them co-conspirators. That is absolutely important because again, we want to make sure that, we don't have to work alone. And that if we have an idea for how we can advance the social justice movement, that we have those who can help out as well. As a lawyer, I am involved in the diversity committee of the Toledo Bar Association. And we try to make sure that within our lane, which is the legal profession in the Toledo area, that we're making sure that it is inclusive and that we are providing opportunities and scholarships and just the resources that minority attorneys need, but also minority law students as well. So we can each show up authentically in our lane, and it will look different depending on your industry. So we want to turn the protest, the frustration, the hopelessness that we felt into tangible goals. And again, that's where I come back to the idea that we want to advocate for change. So how do we do it? Step one, we want to identify key policymakers and their needs. So first, let's talk about the what and the who. Well, what that means is, who do we want to talk to? Okay. And what do we want to talk to them about? So first, when we think about the who, well, when we talk about the local level, it's the mayor, it's city council members, it's county commissioners, it's school board members, etc. Those are all people who represent constituents, all of us. And their job is to make sure that they hear the constituents' needs and thoughts. And they are our elected officials, so they represent us. We want to make sure that they are listening to the ideas, the thoughts, and the needs of the community. So at the local level, that's the who. At the state level, it's our state house members, our state senators, it's the governor, the state elected officials. Those are those policymakers, the who at the state level. And finally, at the federal level, it would be anything from White House officials. So that could include our president, our vice president, and other cabinet positions, federal agencies. So again, it could be, the Department of Justice. It could be the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It could be the Department of Transportation, for example. And then you have United States House of Representatives, United States senators, et cetera. So that would be our congresswoman or congressman. It would also be our senators as well. And one thing that we'll talk about is the fact that, when you get to these legislative bodies like the House and the Senate, they have committees. And also the state House and the state Senate have them as well. And also local elected officials like city council. There are committees that do a lot of this work. And these committees, they're separated by the issue area. So for example, within the House of Representatives, you might have, for example, the Energy and Commerce Committee, or you might have a committee on the judiciary, but they're committees that are doing the work. So part of this is understanding the landscape, understanding, okay, what are the issues that I want to see changed? And then who can help me achieve that goal? So oftentimes it could be the fact that you have an idea of who your local elected official is, but maybe that particular local elected official, or you're a congresswoman or congressman, maybe they're not on that committee that can help to, introduce a piece of legislation to help something happen, right? A piece of legislation to help a policy issue go forward and get voted on. But that doesn't mean that you can't consult your elected official, either at the local, state, or federal level. It just means that, again, you have to be creative. You have to work together to figure out, who do we know that are in those places that can get the things we need to get done? So, as many of you can probably imagine, just like all of us are very busy, policymakers are busy as well. But what they need is for you to do the background work. So, for example, they want you to frame the issue. You have to figure out what is important to this person that I'm talking to. So, for example, when I used to work on Capitol Hill, I would often have members of the particular member I worked for, members of the community. And when I say members, I mean constituents, people from that particular congressman's district who would come in and have meetings with me. And they would talk to me about why I should care. Now, the most effective meetings were the ones where those constituents would say, you know, Congressman Cuellar in Texas, he has this particular issue in his district, and this is why it matters. That's going to be much more effective than if that particular constituent came in and told me about a problem in another senator or another member of Congress's district. It's not quite resonating with me. So you want to frame the issue and make sure that this is going to be something that is understood by a policymaker and it relates to them as well. You also want to provide research and statistics. I often found in those meetings that I had that the most effective meetings were ones where constituents came in and they did their homework. They had the research and the statistics available because often the questions I had was, well, what's the percentage of, this? Or can you tell me how many times this has occurred? Now, you may not have all the answers, but you want to go in armed with the research and the data because that's what's going to help you to be effective. But also, if you don't have an answer, you have to be okay with saying, I don't have this today, but I can certainly get back to you shortly, or I can get back to you by the end of this week with the answer. So you want to make sure that when you go into those meetings that you're armed with the knowledge that you need, but also make sure that you have someone on deck who can help to answer those questions. So if you know of a center that has done the research, identify if you have a contact there or find a contact there who can help you to find the research and the data that you need so that when that particular city council member or the staff member of a congressperson asks you a question that you can find the answer quickly. You also want to share personal stories, and this goes back to framing the issue. The idea is that you want to keep it as close to home as possible. So you want to think about who you're talking to and what they care about. And that you can accomplish that by doing your background research. You want to explain the ROI, the return on investment. You want to explain to this thought leader, this policymaker, why this actually matters and why this is good for the community. So you want to think through these questions before you even go in and meet with any policymaker or their staff. You also want to show comparisons. You want, if possible, if it's relevant to your cause, you want to talk about, what would happen if this policy goal you have is not accomplished? What would that look like? What would our society look like in that instance? Again, these are just arguments to help you make the case for why your issue is so important. You want to explain the other side, but you also want to disprove the other side as well. And this might be a little bit tougher. I know as a lawyer, we have to do this. We learn how to argue both sides of an issue. But what you want to do is you want to look at what are the other side's arguments, if there is another side to your particular view or your policy issue. And you want to acknowledge that this is their position, but also disprove that as well. That's going to be very important to your credibility because what you're doing in that instance is you're basically telling that member, that thought leader, that policymaker, yes, we acknowledge that there's another side to this issue. However, this is why the other side's issue is not something that will bring us to a different place, a place that we want to go in our country. Or this is why, while we acknowledge that the other side has an issue, this is why you should support our issue. So you really want to think of it in that way, because if you don't, I can guarantee you that that policymaker will bring in and will bring up the opposing view just to see if you've thought about it and what your response is to the other view of the subject. And finally, you want to present yourself as an industry expert on the issue. And what I mean by that is you want to be the person that that policymaker can call and say, oh, I'm going to call this person because they know about this issue. And because the reality is that you may go in with one ask on this particular day, but there could be something else that comes up in the future that involves the same issue or the same topic area. And you want to make sure that you are considered the industry expert or the person that can answer that policymaker's questions. That's going to be incredibly valuable to you. And it's going to show that you have a record over time of being reliable and someone who can provide information that's very helpful. So always think about positioning yourself to not only have this one goal of achieving your policy goal, but being the issue expert for the future as well. So step 2, communicating with policymakers. First, what is your goal? You want to think about what is your goal? What do I want to achieve? Again, it could be the fact that maybe you want a legislative fix. Maybe you say to yourself, I really think that we need a police advisory committee, or, I really believe that we need greater resources for our transportation system so that people of all walks of life are able to get to work, to school, to all the places, to the grocery store, to all the places they need to go effectively and in an affordable way. Okay. So you want to think, okay, what is my goal? And then what you want to do is you want to think to yourself, okay, how do I accomplish this goal? Well, oftentimes you may not be able to do it yourself, but the policymaker may have the ability to, maybe they can write an amendment or draft an amendment where they can ask for certain money to be allocated to this particular issue of transportation dollars. Or, maybe it's that you want them to introduce a bill so that, again, you can set up an agency or a committee to deal with, police and communities of color, for example. So you want to think, what is your goal? How can this policymaker help you achieve that goal? You also want to present information in short, bite-sized pieces. I have to tell you, again, as a former congressional staffer, there's nothing worse than when someone comes to you with a ton of information and reports. I mean, think about this. The person that you're probably talking to has a ton of issues that they're working on any given day. But you want to make sure that they can digest this information as quickly and efficiently as possible, and that you've done the work for them. That is going to be very key to making sure that your policy issue rises to, in terms of its level of importance, but also what that actual staffer can actually accomplish. You don't want to use acronyms. And this is something that we all are guilty of, because each industry, we all have our acronyms. But we want to refrain from using those acronyms because we can't rely on the fact that every policymaker, their staff, that everyone knows what we're talking about. So if you're in an industry that uses many different acronyms, try your best to refrain or to clarify what you mean by those acronyms at the beginning of the conversation with that policymaker or staff. You want to practice explaining the issue to a non-expert. This is something that I can tell you is very, very helpful, because the reality is when you go into a meeting with a policymaker, more times than not, you know more than they do about a particular issue. And you want to make sure that you can explain the issue in a way where it doesn't sound completely in the weeds. You don't have to have a master's degree in the particular subject matter that you're talking about to understand it. You want to make sure that anyone could understand what you're talking about. So I would suggest that you practice maybe in front of a friend, a spouse, your mother or father, just someone else that may not know as much as you do about the issue, because then you'll know if they understand it, then you're communicating it well. But again, I wouldn't just rely on one person. I would practice in front of multiple people to get a gauge of whether or not there's a particular topic that you're discussing that may be a little bit unclear to some people. And then you want to refine it. If you get feedback of basically, I don't really understand that issue. What do you mean when you say that you're asking for, this money to go towards these transportation resources or to a police advisory committee. What does that actually mean? What does it look like? How many people do you want on that committee, right? You want to be able to explain what you mean thoroughly, but the only way that you know whether or not it's going to land or not, and whether or not people actually understand what you're talking about, is to vet it through other people and to actually, talk to them and make sure that it makes sense. And also, you want to identify clear arguments and opposing points. I've mentioned this before, but again, you want to make sure that you know the arguments for your side and the arguments against you. And you want to make sure that you bring attention to the opposing views, but not that you highlight them as if they are more valid than your own views, but that you acknowledge them. And then you talk about why your view of the issue still stands and should be paramount in this particular policymaker's mind. So continuing on with step two, communicating with policymakers, you want to educate, right? And you want to know the difference between educating versus persuading. The reality is, again, when you're speaking to be heard and when you're advocating for social justice issues, you want to do both. You want to make sure that you're educating and you're giving this policymaker and their staff the tools necessary to learn more about the issues, but also you want to make sure that you're persuasive. So you're not simply educating, but advocacy means that you're an advocate. And that means that you are petitioning your government. And you are basically saying, this is what I would like to see happen. So you want to make sure that you're not just simply giving them the statistics and telling them why, what's going on, but you're also saying, and this is why it matters. And this is what I want you to do. That's very important to basically have both, to do both, but to understand what both of those categories entail. You also want to set up the meetings for you and your group. And that is something that is often difficult because you want this policymaker to accept your meeting. But in doing so, what I would suggest is that you work with your team. And again, you build a team if you don't have one. I strongly suggest that when you're trying to, when you're trying to influence policy and when you're trying to make fixes and get your goal accomplished, that you don't work in isolation, but you find other like-minded people who can help you. But in doing that, there's value in numbers. And what I mean is that you might poll your group and say, hey, who has a relationship with this particular policymaker? Or who knows this person? You'd be surprised. And that's one reason why you want to make sure that you have diversity in terms of who your group is. And that diversity could look like a variety of different ways. It could be racial diversity. It could be age, in terms of diversity. It could be gender, it can be religion, it could be ability, right? I mean, you want to make sure that you have a very diverse group, and I'm calling this a coalition, but of your coalition to help accomplish this goal. And that will help you when setting up these meetings, because if there's a person in your group who says, oh, I know this particular councilman, this is my neighbor, we talk all the time. Well, that person would likely be the best person to call that city council member and try to set up the meeting. Or if there's a person who knows your member of Congress or your senator very well, again, that's the person who should likely go and try to set up these meetings because they have the relationship with that particular policymaker. You also want to think about the different channels of communication. When you go into this meeting, you want to have something that you can physically give to the policymaker or their staff. This could be print materials. Maybe you create a one-pager. I often love these. Whether I was advocating to a policymaker, like I did when I left Capitol Hill, or when I was a Capitol Hill staffer, I loved receiving print materials that I could look. Because what would happen is that sometimes they would be on my desk and I'd glance over and say, oh, that's right, I need to call this person. Or, oh, let me go back to this list in case there's information that I need to provide the policymaker with. So again, you want to make sure that you have a leave behind that essentially summarizes your argument and the statistics around your issue. Audio visual is often helpful as well. If there's a video or something that can really hone in on the point more than what you could say, don't be afraid to bring technology, bring an iPad with you to this meeting, or point to a link, or send the particular policymaker or their staff in a follow-up, send them a link to a video that has more information. All of these things help you with your advocacy. Policy papers, again, if you summarize and do the background research ahead of time and you have a policy paper to share that as well if you have it. You also, and this is something that I found very helpful when I worked in Washington, was letters to policymakers. Now, this is a whole other discussion that we could talk about, that would be its own presentation. But I often found that constituents would send letters to policymakers all the time. And you would get very similar letters, but that's what would get the attention of policymakers and their staff. If they're noticing that they have 50 letters from constituents in their district who are saying, hey, vote yes on this bill, or we want you to support this policy issue, that's going to get their attention. So now you have this meeting that you had, and then if you have the letters that are coming in from the constituents, those are things to get, those are ways that you can get recognized, and that these policymakers will understand, okay, this is not just a person coming in telling me about what they'd like to see. They have the support of the community as well. So I should probably pay attention. Reports, again, white papers that are on the research that you've done on the particular issue are very helpful. And again, as I said before, leave behinds. You want to make sure that they have information, even if it's something that just says your organization's name on it, including a business card. You want to make sure that you leave this policymaker or their staff with information that can be very, very helpful and that they can remember the meeting. So step 3, create a policy agenda. When I left Capitol Hill and I became a federal advocate for 2 national nonprofits, I advocated for federal funding for urban parks, playgrounds, and other types of conservation. So this could be an elevated rail line that was turned into a park, or it might be access to greater resources for health and for fitness in communities of color. These are the types of issues that I would advocate for to members of Congress. And I worked for an organization that was a national nonprofit, and it had members all over the country. But one of the things that helped us was to create a policy agenda at the beginning of each congressional term. And again, we were advocating to Congress, but even if this means that it's a state or local level, what you want to do is, as an organization or as a coalition, as I've said before, you want to get your friends or get people who you believe can help you with this task. And you want to look at all of the various decisions, all of the various pieces of legislation, resolutions that you've done your research and you've identified that city council or the state legislature or Congress that they're considering that relates to your policy goal, okay? And you want to put all of this in, and usually it's 1 page, but it's an agenda, a policy agenda that basically says, these are the issues that we care about, and this is what we want you to do on each of these pieces of legislation. That is very helpful because as you're having a meeting with a policy maker, not only are you saying, we want you to support this particular issue or we want you to do this specific thing, but also here's our policy agenda so that you know where we stand on these other issues that could come before you as well. So that's very, very important. So you want to create policy categories. You want to think, again, you don't want to be all over the place. You don't want a policy agenda that includes healthcare, defense, transportation, social justice. You want, unless there is a direct link to all of them. But my suggestion would be that you narrow your scope a little bit and you get an idea of these different policy issues that affect your direct ask. That's going to be very important. And again, I want to identify your ask. I can't tell you how many meetings that I've been in where a group will come this is when I was a congressional staffer, and they would say, we want, this is this issue, this is what's going on in the community, but they wouldn't ask for anything. Because when you think about it, what is the point of this meeting other than just pure education? Well, if you want your policymaker to do something, you want to come in and tell them exactly what you want them to do. And you might ask, well, how do I know? Well, that's where your research comes in and working with other like-minded people to figure that out before you go in and talk to that policymaker. You want to include other issues, again, or policies that your organization supports. This is going to be very, very helpful to defining who you are and who your coalition is. And you want to display the agenda. I like cards or leave behinds or one pagers that you can give to that policymaker or their staff so that, again, in the future, they can pull it out and say, oh, that's how this person or this organization feels about this particular issue. And again, in creating a policy agenda, you want to list all the organizations who support your policies. And this goes back to the idea that you don't want to work alone. If you find that you have a particular issue that you care about, and perhaps other community organizations also feel the same way, part of this might be that not only are you advocating to policymakers, but you may be advocating to like-minded organizations to get their support. And then there's strength in numbers, because when you go to that policymaker, it's not just you and your group of your coalition who supports these issues, but it's also these other organizations who support it as well. Again, that only enhances your ability to get your ask accomplished and done. You also want to list all the policymakers who support your policies. If you have gone to several different policymakers, which I hope you have, to have this conversation, if you find a policymaker who says, I support it, I will do whatever I can to make it happen, you add that person to your list. And you mention that particular policymaker when you have the conversation with the next policymaker, because again, you show that there is support for your issues. You include the bill or resolution number, the committee. You include all of these things as well in your policy agenda. So you might say, I want you to support the transportation bill, which is HR, this is if it's in the House of Representatives, HR 3553. By the way, I'm completely making up this number, but HR 3553. Right now, it is in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And this is the next date that they will be voting on it. I mean, if you do that research and you present that to a policymaker, not only are they going to be impressed, but they're going to know that you know what you're talking about and exactly how you can accomplish your goal. That will be very, very helpful when they're determining what they can actually do and what they want to do as a policymaker. Also, you want to make sure that you don't just throw different ideas, different policies or asks on this policy agenda, but that you rank them in order of importance. And this might sound a little bit tough, like, well, how can I separate and rank these different issues? But again, you want to make sure that you either have a short list so that each of those issues has its own and it displays its own importance, or you want to rank them and say, look, if you don't do anything else in this election cycle or in this congressional term, we want you to focus on this issue. So you want to make sure that you have those tough conversations with your fellow coalition members so that you know what your priorities are. Step 4, messaging and strategies for advocacy. So again, you want to have a strong persuasive message, as we talked about. You want to make sure that you're impactful. And I love personal stories. So if you can relate it back to your life or someone close to you or someone in the community, policymakers love stories and they love being able to see a human face on the issue. You want to think about those stories as you're prepping for the meeting with the policymaker so that you can come in and have that real authentic touch. Again, you want to bring it back home. You want to do your research to figure out why it matters to this particular policymaker. Also, you want to be careful to stay on message. I often found when I worked on Capitol Hill that different constituents would come in and they would get so wrapped up in what they wanted to tell me that they would go on tangents and ramble. And again, they, no disrespect to them at all. I mean, I appreciated the messaging, but you have to recognize the fact that this policymaker and or their staff, they're very busy and they want you to stay on message, stay on point. And, in fact, one of the things that I often talk about is that every single person that's attending the meeting, it doesn't need to be your entire coalition. If you have 25 members, do not bring all 25 of those individuals to the meeting. Identify, I would say no more than 4 people. And that's quite a few people. But every person in that meeting should have a role. You want to talk about everyone's role ahead of time. Maybe there's one person who talks about the direct approach and the link to that policymaker's district. You have another person who talks about the research or the statistics, and yet another person who maybe they begin the meeting and they make the connection for why they even introduced or came to that policymaker in the first place. So everyone has to have a role, and you want to be careful to stay on message. As I said before, you want to make the ask. You want to be clear and straightforward. You want to avoid, being vague or generalizations, and you want to tell them again what their support looks like. So, for example, I mentioned this before, making an ask. It might be, I want you to vote yes on issue 2. And maybe issue 2 involves police and communities of color, or maybe it involves another aspect of the social justice movement. Maybe it's social determinants of health. Okay, maybe it's something related to transportation needs for all community members. But you want to tell them, again, by doing your research and figuring out what is our fix here, what is our ask, what do we want this policymaker to do, and you want to ask for that in the meeting. You also want to, maybe the ask is to write a letter to the chairman or chairwoman of the particular committee. Maybe that is the ask, asking for a hearing on your particular issue. Maybe another ask is proposing an amendment to a particular resolution or to a particular piece of legislation in Congress that will carve out a particular local funding grant for women's health services, right? So again, you want to really think about, what is my ask here? And making sure that you make it very clear to this policymaker, this is what we want you to do. Step 5, after the meeting, again, building coalitions. And I would actually argue with myself here that you may not even want to just do this to build this coalition after the meeting. You probably want to do it before as well, but you want to enhance the coalition after the meeting. And what I mean is, you want to continue to build support for your policy. So maybe you started off with 10 or 11 people who all felt the same way. Well, after that meeting, you want to continue to grow your coalition. That's going to be very important to whether or not you're listened to, because these policymakers can see who supports you. So you want to find policymaker champions for your issue. So again, we talked about that briefly, but those are the other policymakers who say to you, I agree, I support you, I will do this. Great. Tell the next policymaker that you talk to, this other particular council person or state representative or congresswoman, they all support this issue as well. You want to make that very clear. You also want to draft support letters on behalf of policymakers as well. You want to give policymakers public credit for championing issues. Now, this is very important. And it's actually pretty simple as well. So if you have a policymaker who says, not only do I support you, but I will write that letter to the chairman of our committee to request a hearing. Great. And let's say that they actually write the letter. Well, what you want to do is issue a press release or, do an interview where you acknowledge and thank that policymaker for their role and what they did. That's only going to enhance your relationship. And it's also going to show other constituents, wow, look what our representative did for us. Look what they did for you, for your community. So you want to give that policymaker public credit. You want to research similar coalitions and encourage them to add your issue to their policy agenda. Again, this is where you do your research ahead of time and even after the meeting. And you say, it's not just our organization, but I really want these transportation dollars or these women health, these, funding for women's health initiatives. I really want this to happen. So let me find another coalition who maybe they can add our issue to their policy agenda. Again, there's strength in numbers, and it only continues to get the attention and keep the attention of policymakers. You also want to engage policymaker caucuses and their members. And I'll tell you about a case study that I did in a moment, where not only did I work within a coalition for a particular issue, but I worked with the policymakers themselves and helped them to create their own caucus or coalition on Capitol Hill to support the issue as well. Because believe it or not, they exist as well. So you might have the House Urban Parks Caucus. It's not made up of members who are part of community organizations. It's made up of policymakers or representatives and senators in Congress or in the Senate who support that issue. Again, you can have events through those caucuses. You can have all those caucus members come together and support a piece of legislation. It's very, very important that you think about, how do I expand my reach and make sure that I'm listened to and that these policymakers understand how important this issue is. But you don't have to just do that in Congress either. You can work on these caucuses at the state level. You could talk to your Ohio state representatives and senators and say, do you guys have caucuses? And if you do, would you be interested in being our champion for, this particular issue area and creating a caucus of your fellow colleagues who can support you in this initiative? So that's very, very helpful as well. And so again, when engaging policy maker caucuses and their members, it helps because when you have an issue that you want direct action on, you can go to these caucuses and say, I know that you're a member of this particular caucus, right? For urban parks, for example. Did you see the most recent bill that Representative so-and-so introduced? Because you're a member of this caucus, I imagine that you'll want to join us in supporting this bill. So again, it gives you more research. And also it's a way for the policymaker to stand up and say, not only do I support this issue, but I have joined this caucus and I champion this as well. So you're giving that policymaker an opportunity to say, this is what I care about. And again, locally, there may not necessarily be a caucus, but you want to make sure that that particular policymaker is able to go on the record and explain why they care about a particular issue in a way that makes sense. So as I mentioned before, the case study that I wanted to share with you. So I want to talk to you about the Urban Parks initiative that I helped to champion this is back in 2008 until about 2012. So when I was in Washington, D.C., after I left Capitol Hill, I joined the National Recreation and Park Association. And that is a national organization of usually it's park districts across the country. And there are some individual members as well. And basically, we represented the needs of the parks industry. Now, what I found is that there were no direct funding resources for urban parks nationwide. In fact, if there was a community that wanted to create an urban park, they would often tap into other resources that weren't directly related to urban parks. So there was an old bill that was called UPAR, which is like the Urban Park and Recreation Resources Bill, essentially. But the problem was that funding was not restored. Okay, so it had not been funded recently by Congress. And again, this is when we were going to Congress and asking for resources. So the first thing I did was I engaged local park members and updated the bill. So I looked at the old bill and I said, okay, this is an older bill. It's been around since the 90s. There's been no funding for it. Let's look at that old bill and see what we can do to update it based on our needs today and the current trends that we see. So that was very helpful because I had a group of big city and mid-sized cities, their parks directors, and I talked to them. And really anyone could join if they wanted to, that was a parks director. And we talked about updates and fixes to the current bill. That was very helpful because we essentially repackaged the bill with some new updates. And we thought about funding sources that made sense and how much money we thought should be in that bill, and we updated it. Once we were done, and that was a hard part, it took a lot of work to figure out line by line and section by section how to update that bill. And then we secured a congressional sponsor for the new bill. We found a member of Congress from New Jersey, Representative Albio Ceres, and we went to his office. We talked to him about how many urban parks he had in New Jersey, and this was an area of Newark, New Jersey. We talked to him about how many urban parks were there, what they could do if this funding were available, and we convinced this particular member of Congress and their staff to support us. And not only did they support us, but they decided that they would introduce the bill that we wrote. Now, there's a much more complicated process for how a bill becomes a law, and I encourage you to look up the old Schoolhouse Rock videos, and not only that, but to do the research to figure out how that actually happens in the legislative process. But To be quite honest, it's a lot of research from everyday people and organizations who are doing the research to figure out how can we create words, right, in this legislation that are going to help us achieve our goals. So we worked with Congressman Sierra's office and convinced them to be our champion. But once we had them on board to be our champion, they would go around and they would ask their colleagues on Capitol Hill, other members of Congress, to also support this bill as well. And then also, I encouraged Representative Sierra's office to create an urban parks caucus on Capitol Hill because I noticed that there were other caucuses, and this is what I mentioned before. These are basically issue areas where members of Congress supported these particular issues. But I said, there is no specific urban parks caucus, and we can use this caucus to get momentum and to get other members of Congress who care about these issues as well to support and join the caucus and then also be a co-sponsor of our new legislation that was introduced. So we created that Urban Parks Caucus, and it was made up of members across the country. And also, part of our ask when we went in after the legislation was introduced, we would ask policymakers or congressmen to support this bill, but we would also say, we would also love for you to join the Urban Parks Caucus that Representative Sierra's recently started. So again, it really secured the momentum and it helped us to secure that support of our issue because not only did we want this specific ask to happen, we wanted this member to co-sponsor the bill, sure, to sign on to the bill, but we also we wanted their support for the larger issue as well. And then we would organize days on the Hill. And really what that is basically constituents, everyday people who live in a particular policymaker or representative's district. We would organize days where they would come to Capitol Hill and they would go to their local, representative and say, hey, Congresswoman so-and-so, this is why you should care and this is why you should support the urban parks bill. So again, we organized these days on the Hill, but we didn't just send people in from the different districts, and this is across the country, by the way. So nationwide, people came in from their various cities to talk to their women and their congressmen. But what we did was we had training for them. Okay, so I would conduct training for these various constituents coming into town, and I would say, this is a mock meeting. Let's do a practice run. This is how the meeting happens. This is, everyone's going to have a role. I would do something very similar to what I'm doing now so that they felt comfortable going into that meeting. And also we would, again, we would add new bills and caucuses to our policy agenda. And that's part of what the constituents would leave their members of Congress with, the policy agenda and the next steps of what we wanted them to do. And a note on those meetings is that one thing that was very surprising to some of the constituents and members of our community who would go to these meetings is they would say, often these are professionals who have worked in their field for, 15, 20 years. They were so surprised that the person they were meeting with was very young. And that is something that many people don't realize about, and I'll just speak specifically for Capitol Hill, but I know this applies to our state legislature as well, is that oftentimes the staff member who works for this policymaker, they look very young because they are young oftentimes. But you shouldn't underestimate that staffer because they have the ear of the policymaker. And oftentimes you don't even, I know there's this temptation to want to meet with the person whose name is on the outside of the door. Okay. We call those vanity meetings in my industry. Sometimes you don't want that meeting with the actual member, right? Or the actual senator, or et cetera, or the actual state legislature or, the state senator or state house member. Sometimes you actually want to meet with the staff member because if the staff member looks at you as a resource and they understand and they buy in, then they're going to be able to make the case to their boss, the policymaker, in a way that you will not be able to because that staff member sees that person more regularly and they're able to explain to them how this issue that you support, this social justice issue, for example, fits into that policymaker's overall agenda, the legacy that that particular policymaker wants to leave. So again, I really, really want to make sure that you all understand that sometimes that staffer, you may think, oh, I didn't get a meeting with the mayor, or I didn't get a meeting with, the congresswoman. Sometimes that's the best situation because that staff member can now be your advocate. So I've said a lot of information today, and I just want to thank you so much for your patience as I've discussed this very complex issue. I do want to follow up and just say that, there are several things that you can obviously keep in mind when trying to advocate to your local elected officials. But the main things that I want to leave you with are these. You want to identify your role in the social justice movement. Again, we can all have a role, but we have to figure out what is that role going to be and how can I help to accomplish my particular goal. Today, I have talked to you about advocacy, and I see advocacy as a tool for change. So, regardless of what your issue is, following these steps will help you because they will help you in an organized way to be able to get the ear of that policymaker to help achieve the goal that you have. So, you want to identify the key issues and the thought leaders ahead of time. As I said before, do your homework, do the research, figure out what is your ask going to be. Also, you want to practice, do mock meetings. You want to talk to people who are not the policymaker or the staff, someone who's not a part of your coalition to figure out, is what I'm saying, does it make sense? You want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what your issue is and whether or not other people can follow your view as well. You want to go into these meetings with other people. I would suggest again, no more than 4 people, but you don't want to go into the meeting alone because there's strength in numbers. You want to establish an ongoing relationship so that you're viewed as a resource. I mentioned this earlier. You want to be considered the expert in your industry. And sometimes that's more valuable than just one issue specifically, because you never know when these issues are going to come up again. And you want to be someone that that policymaker can call in the future. Again, respect the staffers. I understand. I heard so many people who would come to Capitol Hill on our behalf when I represented this parks organization, who would often say, that particular staffer looks like they could be my granddaughter. Okay, but you have to respect that staffer because, again, they have the ear of that policymaker. And just to wrap up, I know I just told you that case study about urban parks. So you may be wondering, well, what happened, right? What happened with this particular piece of legislation? And we were very lucky that we were able to not necessarily pass a standalone bill related to that particular issue, but oftentimes what happens in Congress is that pieces of other pieces of legislation, right, will end up being incorporated into a much larger bill that talks about a variety of different issues. And urban parks funding was a category that was eventually, where funding was eventually dedicated to helping in other ways. So for example, we had a bill called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and that was something where we could possibly, support urban parks through the funding. But again, one thing that people don't often think about is that these bills, they take years, sometimes decades to pass. So the work doesn't just stop, and you can't identify success as if my bill was passed. Because when you're working in the advocacy space, like I know many of you are interested in, it takes years, and you have to figure out, what does success look like? Success could look like, I talked to 10 policymakers this year. Each of them now understand the issue, and each of them have now agreed to co-sponsor a piece of legislation, or they've agreed to be the champion for this cause so that they can make the case, or they have agreed to write a letter to their committee, right, the chair of their committee, to get a hearing on this issue. So you want to be very clear, and you want to be very realistic about what success looks like for you and your coalition and the things that you care about most, because it's often not just black and white. It's not just, did I get this bill passed or did I not? Sometimes it is the education, it is the advocacy, it's raising awareness of the issue, but also, again, creating tangible steps to help you get closer to your goal. And finally, for final thoughts, following up with the information pieces as they are developed. And that just means you want to follow up with the staffers, with the policymakers, especially as you see progress in a particular issue. So if you see that there are 5 more members who have signed on to the new legislation that you want to see accomplished, right, or that you want to see passed, you know, following up with that policymaker, keeping them updated, keeping their staff member updated about what's going on. And finally, I just again want to thank you for your time today. I work at Shumaker, Loop and Kendrick as an attorney. I practice employment law and I also practice litigation. And what that basically means is that, you know, I help businesses, I help people to figure out how to accomplish their needs. Oftentimes that means that I work with employers and helping them to make sure that they can get ahead and make sure that there are no future issues regarding discrimination and harassment in the workplace. But another aspect of what we do at Shumaker is that we have a government affairs area where when there are issues and greater coalitions and issues that people want to see passed, that there are people who are on our team who can help to accomplish those goals. That group is called Shumaker Advisors, and they actually have various offices across the country. They're in Florida, they're in Ohio, and they are comprised of actual government affairs professionals who are talking to policymakers on a regular basis. That's another level of how advocacy can happen as well. So I just want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your patience. This is my contact information, and I'm sure Casey and other staff members in the Center for Women and Gender Equity can also provide you with my information as well. I know this was a lot of information, but I just want to let you know that the feeling that many of us felt last year when it came to social justice issues and what was going on in our country, it's completely normal to feel the way that we did. But this is our time and this is our opportunity to see change actually happen. But we have to do our homework and we have to organize and figure out a way to make sure that we can raise awareness of these issues and that we can keep these issues in the front of our policy makers' minds and in their hearts. So I thank you again today. I thank the Center for Women and Gender Equity, and I welcome you and encourage you to keep in touch with me. And I just wish you all the best of luck in this conference and in your lives. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much. I feel like I just learned just a ton because I think it's so easy to say, I want this thing to change, or I'm so upset about, you know, XYZ, or I'm really, you know, people are just like you said, so wanting to do something related to social justice and just not knowing where to start. And so I think there are so many tangible things that you left us with that it gives me kind of like a renewed sense of hope that like, okay, here are some actual things that I can do. And I love this idea of like getting your people, like building your coalition to actually move forward and do something, and not just do something, but like ask for what it is that you want. And it seems like that's like the step that a lot of people don't get to, right? So this was fantastic. So I just want to thank you again so much for being with us. And I'm so excited about the information that you shared, and I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I look forward to staying in touch with you, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I greatly appreciate it, and I truly believe that advocacy is a tool for change.
Absolutely. And I also want to share with everyone that I hope that some of you were able to watch our poets that were part of the Women of Color Leadership Summit, and also that you will join us for Kirby Overton's presentation as well. And know that we have a ton of other events in the month of March for Women's History Month from across campus, programming from across campus, and you will be able to find that on our campus calendar, and it's at bgsu.edu/women's history. And this presentation will also be available. So if you want to go back and rewatch it and take some notes and get Ashley's contact information again, it will be there as well. And all this information and all of our programs, obviously for Women's History Month, will remain on our Instagram and our Facebook page for the Center for Women and Gender Equity as well. So thank you again for joining us. And thank you again, Ashley. This was fantastic.
Thank you.